former minister, and founder of Something or Other Publishing, Wade Franson, is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society, from messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted through our culture. Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Tonight's episode, The Hidden Tree, with Valton Brown.
Good evening, everyone. It's Tuesday evening, 8 p.m. Central. It's time for Created in the Image of God. I'm your host, Wade Franson. We've got a wonderful guest lined up. He's here in the virtual studio with me, a person who I've really enjoyed getting to know in preparation for this show. He is born to Jamaican parents who immigrated to the UK during the Windrush generation. He was raised with values instilled by his entrepreneurial father and praying mother. He embraced faith at 15, shaping his life's trajectory. Despite facing challenges typical for a young Black man, he excelled, becoming a chartered architectural technologist in addition to being a Bible advocate. Using the metaphor of a tree, he explores the historical out-of-sight root system and its evolutionary origin while looking forward to its purpose and goal through God technology. I'll stop there because I'm not even sure I completely understand all the items that he's describing in his book, The Hidden Tree. But we have the author in the studio with us today, and we're going to unpack it. First, we're going to get to know him. So let's welcome into the studio. It's Valton Brown.
Hi,
How are you
Wade.
doing this evening?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks for having me on your show as well.
Early morning for you, right? Over there in the UK?
Yeah, it's 2:00 in the morning. So yeah, it's very early.
That's dedication. Are you in a sleepy vibe? Are you in a or are you amped up on coffee? How's that going for you?
Yeah, I think I'm probably more towards amped up. I think, So I've been looking forward to having this conversation with you. So,
well, we're excited to have you, and we want to jump right in. As our guests know, this first portion of the show is always your creation story. Where did you come from? We shared a little bit in that little intro, but you were born of Jamaican parents, but you were actually born in the UK prior or after they arrived?
yes. I was born in a place called Derby, which is almost central in the UK. And it's a small place. It used to be a town. It's now recognised as a city because it has a university and a cathedral and that sort of thing. But yeah, I was born into a place that there were a number of Black families that came from Jamaica and eventually kind of created a community there. So we pretty much knew our neighbours very well. We knew pretty much anyone in the locality. And yeah, so that's where I was born and raised. And to be honest, I've only recently moved out of Derby City after so many years.
So are you more suburban or a little bit out in the country now?
Out in the country, yeah. So a little bit more isolated, But it's nice to have the choice of being in the country than going into the city, rather than being fixed in the city, if that makes sense.
So was there strategic intent in that to get closer to nature, to become more self-sufficient, or was it more happenstance?
Yeah, it was just circumstances, really. Just as it's how we gradually ended up living. To be honest, I spent pretty much most of my life in the city, and when we got married, my wife is Golda. Over a period of time, we found ourselves moving away from the centre of the city, more towards the outskirts, and then eventually into a village. And then we thought, actually, this is quite nice to be able to come away, after a hard day's work, and literally dial down. So we kind of always look for that. We adapt, we like to have that.
Yeah, I was just curious if there was some tie-in there to the technology that you mentioned about your book. We'll get there more
Sure.
deeply in the next segment, but let's go back to those Jamaican parents and the values that were instilled. Your entrepreneurial father, your praying mother. What were your early formative years like? As far back as you can go in your memory, what were the family ideas, family values, community values that shaped who you are today?
Yeah, well, the word community was for me, it strikes a chord because, I mean, when I was a kid, I can remember my neighbour, which lived 2 doors away. Her son was about the same age as myself. We were going to go to the same school, and she would literally invite me over for breakfast on a Sunday morning. So I'd run up the road in my pajamas and sit around the table, and she knew I loved porridge, so she'd make me this huge bowl of porridge, um, and that sort of typified what I experienced because everybody knew each other and helped each other out. It was genuinely like that. We had a guy that lived across the road. He was a tailor, so if we needed trousers or stuff making, my father would speak to him about clothing, and you know, it was quite a strong community vibe that was going on there at the time, which I think was a throwback from the fact that some of the families probably would have known each other from Jamaica, and when they came over, and even if they didn't, they came into that experience really, and that's how it was for quite a long time, you know.
You mentioned the Windrush generation in your little
Mm.
bio. What is that?
Yeah, well, it really is just the period when Jamaicans came over into the UK. I think there was actually a ship that was named the Windrush.
Got it.
Yeah, so and because Jamaica was part of the sort of British Empire, so to speak, they were invited to come over after the war to help to rebuild the UK. And so that opportunity, many in Jamaica thought it was going to completely transform their lives. They thought the streets in the UK were paved with gold. That's the story that pretty much everyone was speaking about. And so they took the invitation and came over here. Of course, uh, the experience when they got here was probably quite a shock, because it was cold. You know, it was, you know, never having seen snow and things like that. It was a challenge, and then having to find places to live and to work. Those were the other things that became a real problem and an issue. Of course, I was not even born then, but it you know, I heard enough of the stories from my parents to know it was quite a challenge.
Yeah, when I was a teen in Alaska, we had a friend who come from one of the Caribbean islands. I forget which one now.
Yeah,
It wasn't Jamaica, but anyway, up in Alaska, right? And
yeah.
first snow, he went out and was wiping the snow off his car with his bare hand.
Oh wow.
And I mean, he's like, the snow, it bit me. He said it bit me. And he didn't know snow could do that. And at
Yeah,
that temperature, yeah,
yeah,
it's like a painful, dangerous to the skin because that glass on the window more
yeah,
than the snow is
yeah,
probably what bit him, but and
yeah,
I don't know. Anyway, so but how can you really understand something that's that foreign?
yeah. Absolutely. And you've got no reference at all for it, you know.
Right.
So, and then I've always thought that the challenge to adapt was then huge. But somehow they managed to do that. You know, they supported each other. I mean, my parents lived with other couples when early doors, you know, and they shared a room. Um, of course, there was no central heating as we have now. It wasn't modern
Right.
facilities, and looking after each other's children as well. So it's everything almost rolled into one. Because again, I remember the school that I went to, the first school, hadn't even been built. So I spent a lot of time at home, or if my mother had to work, she would, not often, but she would leave me with someone that she knew to take care of me.
Well, you
S
mentioned your entrepreneurial father, so
Yeah.
I'm assuming that he really didn't want to let go of that dream that the streets were made of gold, and that if he
Mm.
could just find the right, the Germans have a saying, a green ein grüner Zweig, a green branch. You know,
Yes.
get attached to a green branch, one that's growing, that's doing well. He probably thought if I can just get in the right
Mm.
niche, industry, product,
Yeah.
system, whatever, I
Yeah.
can make it.
Absolutely.
Did he ever make it, or was that something that
Yeah.
was an ongoing disappointment for him? And did that affect you in various ways?
Yeah, well, I think my father was a big inspiration, to be honest, because there's two accounts really. I can remember as a boy when it was the middle of winter, snow was on the ground, and he was going to miss his bus, so he'd run up the street, and I'd say to my mom, "Can I go with him?" So I'd run behind him all the way to the corner of the street and say goodbye to him, and then he'd continue his run on to catch the bus. And I remember my mother saying that he worked for a very short period. He worked in a foundry, and she bought him some very thick denim to wear. And when he came home, he had holes in his denim from the molten metal that had spat out at him. So unlike today, where it's all health and safety. So immediately, my mother was saying to him, "Look, I'd rather have you than someone bring flowers to my door saying that you had an accident or what have you." And so he was very much a family man, very committed to the family. He had a huge amount of respect for my mother as well, and insisted that we had to do the same, of course. Um, but he was semi-illiterate, so he could write to help himself by signing documents and things. But often he would ask us to just read through documents and sometimes complete them for him. But he was an extremely clever man, very practical. So the story I always tell is when he wanted to build a shed one day. I know it sounds quite simple, but he decided to build this shed. He sat down with a sheet of paper, drew it all out, put all the measurements on. He said, "Right, lads, let's go and get all the timber." And we're thinking, "Dad's going to build a shed. You buy one, you don't build one. And true to form, we went and got all the lumber, all the timber, came back. He mapped it out in the garden, put the frame together, put the blocks in place. And that it became like a little house because it remained there after my father passed away, after my mother passed away, and even when the house was sold, it still stood there as a monument to his ability. But
Testimony. Yeah.
yeah, but he did do a lot of other things as well, you say.
So let's talk just a little bit about your mother then, especially
Mm,
the religious component. You mentioned to me in previous discussions
mm,
that there was sort of a continuation of the tradition, the religious tradition
mm,
from Jamaica in a church of God, small church of God, where there was a
mm.
Sabbath keeping church, right?
Yeah,
Observing the
yeah,
seventh day Sabbath, Saturday as the Sabbath.
yeah, yeah.
What was that like in Great Britain?
That was interesting. But my mother, just to maybe clarify it, my mother actually didn't. She wasn't churched at all, from what I know. So when she came here, it was an encounter that she had in a nightclub that started her whole journey, really. And initially, the fellowship that we were in began in a home because there were no sort of church buildings and things that they could use. So they started in a home, and it was really a way, I think, of being able to connect with each other because they're from Jamaica. Um, and my mother, when she had that encounter, which, as I say, was in a nightclub, she wasn't in a service or anything. She had a God encounter in the nightclub. She was looking for somewhere to fellowship with people of like mind, and knew this group that were meeting, and went along and found that there were other people who were walking a very similar walk. Back then, I think, and I was I was extremely young when my mother was saved, so it didn't make sense to me initially, you know. But I did recognize that she'd completely changed, completely transformed. And my father, being the kind of man he is, he called us together as children and says, "Right, things are going to change because now your mother's a Christian." And I'm like, "What?" you know. And of course, we resisted a little bit when it came to going to church with her and things. But ultimately, that and other experiences like it really just started to set out a journey that I didn't realize it was going to put me on and the family.
So when did that journey really begin to take shape in earnest for you? How old were you, and what were some of the circumstances around your coming of age and
Yeah,
becoming the man that you are today with the views that you hold? And I recognize that it didn't all happen at once, but
yeah,
where was the turning point?
yeah. Well, from far back as I can remember, when I was a boy, I always had this awareness, I would say, of God, and a sense that I want to do more than what I'm doing. I know it sounds a bit strange for a young lad. For example, typical, we had a storm one night, and there was a power cut, and I was upstairs as a young lad, and the lightning was going, the thunder, and I was petrified, right? Because I remembered one verse in the Bible, one verse, as the lightning flashes from the east unto the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. So I ran downstairs, petrified, thinking Jesus is coming back. And I said to my mother, I says, "Is Jesus coming back?" And she's washing the dishes in the dark with a candle, And she just laughed at me and says, "No, son, he's not coming back yet." But that awareness was from a very young age. But I decided that I would, I had my own plans, and I wanted to do other things. So by the time I got to my teenage years, my ambition was music, as probably most of the guys I knew was. It was music, and so I went along to a convention in London, which I attended just to get a chance to play on the instruments. That was it. That was my goal. And I sat at the back of the church during this particular service. I wasn't paying attention to the sermon or anything that was going on. I deliberately sat at the furthest corner, and it was the old wooden pews. They were all full, and all I can say is that I was sat there one moment. The next minute, I found myself knelt down at the front, just broken, weeping, and the only way I can explain it was like a video being played, and in seconds, the Lord was saying to me, "Are you willing to let go of this, and this, and this? Now choose." I said, "Well, I choose you," and that was the point at which uh, I really began to recognize that there was so much more, and that God really did exist. That was the turning point for me. Of course, it wasn't an easy walk from there on, but I remember I think it was the following year, I sat in the convention in the same place, and I was playing the guitar, and I stopped, and this overwhelming thought took a hold of me, just saying, "Is this it? Are we just going to? Is this what you do? You come to a service, you play music, you sing, you pray, and then you go home." And that was kind of a scary thought. So that question turned into many other questions over a period of time.
Well, and they eventually led to you reading a book. We'll unpack some of the time between that early experience in the church
Mm,
and you writing the book. But I want to jump to the period of time where you wrote the book, because we're going to
sure.
play just a very intriguing video
Mm,
trailer about your book here in a moment. Um, but so how long from that moment, and what age
mm,
were you when you realized you needed to write the book, and then when you
yeah.
got the book written, and what were some of the circumstances around the idea of why the book had to be written?
That is a very good question, and I would probably answer that by saying this was a book that found me. I didn't think I could write a book. I didn't see myself as an author. Okay, I'm the kid that was dropped from doing English at school, you know. So that wasn't my
Not
plan.
by might, not
Yeah,
but by not by might, not by power, but by my spirit, the Lord said to Zerubbabel. I'm actually giving a
absolutely.
presentation on that this Sunday.
Right.
All the
Yeah.
better that it didn't really come from you.
Yes. Yes. So it was. There were questions over a period of time, that really embedded themselves in me, and it wasn't until probably around about 2014, somewhere around about there, that I thought, actually, I need to just make some notes on some of the things I'm thinking about, and then the whole thing started to take on a life of its own, which, um, how can I explain it? I mean, there were so many different things that happened, I suppose if I was going to pinpoint anything, I remember hearing in a service that black people were under a curse, and I thought, that's an intriguing thought. Where does that come from? and it was obviously to do with Noah, and
I'm familiar with that line of
yeah,
doctrine or
yeah,
teaching. Yeah.
yes. So you can imagine, I thought that sort of took a hold of my young mind, and I was thinking, what? How could that be? But then the intriguing thing was that whenever anything went wrong, or if I had an experience that I really didn't like, I would start to think about that one teaching.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. And so that really became a
Like a
problem.
virus, right? It's like a
Yeah.
virus that one gets infected with.
Yeah, exactly. And it was because I'm inquisitive, and I believe that what God has given us in His Word is right. So I wanted to know, and so that was one of the questions that started a whole trail of other questions, and uh, and then other experiences as well, such as there were young men in our community that just didn't. They seemed to just disappear, and I remember asking my older sister, "Where are these guys? What happened to them?" Because we knew everyone by name, the families, etc. Until some years later, when I was asked to carry out a survey to produce plans for a psychiatric hospital, they were going to do some modifications to the access and things like that. And I went into this building, and I saw some of the guys there. I said to them, "What are you doing here?" I mean, I didn't really know what a psychiatric hospital was like until I went in it, and then that started off a whole load of other questions. How is it that all these guys are kind of disappearing into this system? What is that about? Yeah. So these were questions I thought that were separate to each other. But then, as I say, sort of around about 2014, it started to all come together, and then people were coming to me with bits of information, which during the time when my wife and I were preparing for a small event that we were having, and so gradually this picture began to form. And I was talking to my wife and my daughter, and it was like, you really need to write this. So that's where it kind of began.
All right. Well, let's go to that break now and give
Sure.
everyone a taste of that book through the video. And we're seeing a number of comments in the chat. Thank you to those fans who are here with us across the various channels, YouTube, Facebook, and I do hope that you'll continue that, because at the end of the show, we will be awarding a copy of Valton's book, The Hidden Tree, to the comment that he picks as the most intriguing, interesting, funny, engaging, whatever. But for now, a quick video trailer on his book. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to learn about this book and peel back the onion about what it's about and the experiences that led to it.
Revolution, a decade that worshipped the human intellect and embraced the philosophy of humanism. The seed of evolution was planted, and the religion of eugenics was born. A religion that destroyed generations through the Holocaust, the 1960s occult culture, and racial laws. That was then, and this is now. Homo Deus, era of the man-god. Explore the historical out-of-sight root system in the book The Hidden Tree by Valton Brown, available at Amazon and other major retailers.
And there it is. What an intriguing trailer. Makes me want to jump in and read it right now. Can't do that, but thankfully we have the author of that work with us right here in the studio. So Valton, where to begin? Let's start by talking about eugenics.
Yeah.
There may be some who don't know what that is. Share with us what eugenics is, and then how it features in your work.
Yeah. Well, eugenics is basically it comes from a Greek word, which means good seed. Okay, and it was an offshoot of. This is how I map it out in the book. I'm not going to give away everything, but it's an offshoot of the theory of evolution, the survival of the fittest. So eugenics was the product of Francis Galton, who was the cousin of Charles Darwin, who believed that we could apply the sort of ideas that Charles Darwin and others had prior to him. We could apply it to the human race. So rather than waiting for the human race to evolve, we actually give it a helping hand. So anyone that's
Sorry, I had a fur ball jump up in my lap here. This is my daughter's cat, Licorice.
oh right.
There she is. She's big, but anyway, it's a Maine Coon cat. Sorry,
That's
she
all right.
wanted to make an appearance on the show. Apparently, sorry to interrupt, but so the cousin of Charles Darwin was
Yes.
involved in establishing.
Eugenics.
Was it called a science? The science of eugenics?
Yes, yeah, they absolutely believed it was scientific, but it's a pseudoscience, and really what it was about is separating people that are classed as being unfit from those that are superior. Okay, and it was a very, very big movement, and most people think it's gone away, it's done, but in actual fact, it's really just changed its brand and how it's applied. So it was a very, very big thing, which also, of course, led to the likes of people like Hitler coming to power in Germany. It's the same philosophy that he believed in that shaped what happened during the war. And so as a result of that as well, we've got so many different elements of legislation and different things that have been influenced by this very philosophy. I mean, I can go back to the roots.
Isn't it amazing that sometimes really bad ideas become the most infectious?
For sure. And that was the key to the book, you see, because it's really looking at, and again, remember the questions I had, it all sort of morphed together, and it was a case of, right, how do I map this out that someone can actually understand it? Because I realized that this was quite a huge web of different elements and subjects, and that's why the tree was used as the metaphor, because it started with a soil, which if you look at the slave trade, the mindset, the language, and that sort of thing was firmly established through the slave trade. And then we have evolution, which really was Charles Darwin became the brand of something that people were just waiting for someone like that to appear, and there we have a seed of evolution planted, which I call it a religion because of what it stands for. And then out of that comes eugenics, and then this whole root system begins to develop, which touches all aspects of society.
Well, I've commented in the past on my view that religion, when it arrives, when God provides divine guidance, that guidance is pure.
Yeah.
The water is pure. But it's like the minute it touches the ground and people start getting involved in it, it becomes less pure, right?
Yeah.
To the point where eventually it's very muddy water indeed. And I've commented that then you can get those who seek to control the religion cordon off a section of that water. It becomes a kiddie pool instead of a pure flowing river or an ocean. And then that kiddie pool, having had toddlers, I know that when you go to a resort and you end up in the kiddie pool with your young kids, the water there smells of chlorine and diapers. I'm sorry, it's bad.
Yeah.
It's bad, and that's your vacation. But what the corrupting influence, and this is the main thought here: the corrupting influence, the cancer, if you will, the virus that can infect any religion, even those of a pure origin, right? Is this idea that we are superior.
Correct.
Right? Correct. Jesus, it says, emptied himself and thought it not robbery to have his station with God, and yet to humble himself. And And the mind of Christ is explained as esteeming others better than yourself.
Yep.
But somehow it's typical of a religion to begin esteeming oneself and the adherents of the religion as being better than
Mm.
others who are not of that religion.
Yeah. Well, this is, sorry. Go ahead.
So, but you're talking about a religion that's founded on that principle, right? Rather than a corrupting influence infecting a
Yeah.
pure religion.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, uh, I mean, I've got, for example, I had an email that came through early in the process, which it had a video link to it. It was from a financial company. I was interested to know what's happening with the British economy and things like that. But the video wouldn't play. And I thought, I tried everything. The only thing I could get was a transcript. And I thought, that's not going to be helpful. And it was like a gentle nudge saying to me that, the Lord saying to me, actually, that's what you need. And
Right.
I've got a copy of it here, which probably in reverse on the camera, but it's called Homo Deus. And that came along at a time when I was sort of beginning to flesh out some of this book. Now, the tree itself, the eugenics tree, which if anyone in the audience is familiar with it, you can look at the root system and there is the word religion in it. And I thought that was really intriguing. How could this philosophy embrace religion as one of its root system, as part of its root system? So I had to step back from that and realized that there are two very clear streams that I needed to really address. First of all, the worldview I would look at this whole thing from is a biblical one. I had to set the measure first. From what perspective am I going to review this? Because the subject matter, you could look at politics and you could look at that all day, depending on what your particular persuasion is, or medicine, or what have you. But as soon as you set the measure to say that it's a biblical worldview, then it's clear to everyone what you're going to read is through that lens, And that's when humanism, which undergirds all of these philosophies, stands in contrast to the biblical worldview. Humanism being the worship of self, which is where we get the problems of people thinking, I'm better than the next person. It's all about me.
An excessive focus on our self-esteem.
Yeah. Yes. And so eugenics really is just another offshoot of that, and it does grow into other things. And the hidden tree really is trying to break that down into an introduction into that world, so people can be made aware of, first of all, what to be careful of, and also to understand that, as you've said, God is not about any sort of form of elitism. When Yeshua, Jesus, was here, he was teaching his disciples about whoever's first will be last, and the last first. It's his equality, and that's what we really need to have now, especially now.
Yeah, if you look into Judaism, it was so far ahead of its time in its social teachings. I often like to try to help people understand who haven't really studied the Bible that the economic system that Moses brought included care for the land, right? Dress and keep the garden is the commandment that Adam was given before Eve even arrived on the scene. The be fruitful and multiply command came later. Of course, once Eve arrived, man forgot all about caring for the garden and was more interested in being fruitful and multiplying, right? But that's a command that was easily obeyed, such that we became the most invasive species the world has ever known, and threaten the entire planet today. But in Judaism, you had the land Sabbath, right? Which is one reason why I love the fact that people should be aware of the Sabbath, the seventh-day Sabbath, because it was part of this whole system. The religion of Moses, Judaism, is so complex and so holistic. You have care for the land in terms of the land Sabbaths that come every 7 years. Then you have debt forgiveness every 7 years. Then you have 7 times 7, the year of Jubilee, in which all the land is returned to the families. So you can't have aggregation of centralized power and wealth, because the source of wealth, the land, is apportioned out to the people, and
Yeah.
it reverts to the people, no matter how foolish or sinful your grandfather was.
Mm. Mm.
The
Yeah.
land is going to come back to you,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And this system would resolve so many economic conflicts, and even, then there's all kinds of social laws about the kind of protective barriers you have to put on your roof to protect people from
Correct.
falling off, what you have
Hmm.
to do to protect your animal from harming somebody. You have to leave the corners of your field unharvested so that the poor can glean from it. You have to leave enough for those in need.
Mm.
All these laws, they're so advanced. They're
Absolutely.
so advanced. But the people that Jesus came to were not only in servitude to the Romans,
Hmm.
they were in servitude to their religious leaders who had so corrupted the divine teachings and
Mm.
created laws such as Korban, if you know, I'm sure you know what that is,
Yeah.
right? Where
Yeah.
you could get out of certain laws which
Responsibilities.
required you to take care of your parents, for example, or other
Yeah.
needy people, by donating it to the church. So you could get out of obeying the law of God if you gave your money to the church. Who came up with that law?
Yeah. Exactly. And all what we read in the Bible, it really highlights what happens when when Jesus is not central, when his Father is not central to what we call faith. The moment we move away from focusing on him, it becomes about anything other than, and the possibilities are endless. See, so as you rightly said in the book of Genesis, which is where I start in the book, it's first and foremost about that relationship. It was a relationship of trust, and not only that, but God lavishly creating this whole world and this universe and saying, "This is for you," basically, and then the equality between male and female.
There's your self-esteem, right? That I have I have created you sovereign, right?
Mm.
The only thing that governs you is the greater and lesser lights in heaven to rule the day and the night, so that even in the darkest hour, you have some light shining on you to guide your path. Submit to the light, and you will never become enslaved.
Yeah. Well, this is the beautiful thing, isn't it? Because when you look at that relationship, it was in sort of a perfect unison. And I remember the first time I heard someone speaking about how when God said to Adam, "Here you go, you name the animals," you
Right.
know? And you think, well, what kind of relationship was that? There was not one animal that God says, "Just a minute, you got that one wrong." Yeah, because there was that perfect relationship, something that we're still striving to try and regain. But then, as you say, by the time we get to Jesus in the New Testament, of course, the nation of Israel, which was really to be the model to the rest of the world, they'd fallen into such disarray because of a history of placing other things first. And that's, as you say, when you begin to see the religious elite and the sick and the broken, because when you read when they came out of Egypt, for example, the Bible tells us that none of them were ill. Their clothes didn't wear away.
Right.
They were kept in this perfect ecosystem. Yeah,
They were provided for.
exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not until they move away from God that we see what happens. And it's interesting how it doesn't matter what century it happens, that we spiral into this darkness, and it becomes about me, myself, and I.
So we talked about eugenics as the root system.
Hmm.
Um, but so what tree then
Mm.
arises from that? You talked about Hitler and the Holocaust, and I think the
Yeah,
implications there are pretty clear. The
yeah,
master race,
yeah,
and so on, and Aryanism. But then beyond, and then racial laws. Take us from there, and
yeah.
maybe the extent of that, because that was
Sure.
something that was around the globe really for a while, until
Yeah,
it began to be dismantled and pushed aside, and some elements of justice arose. But what is the nature of that tree today?
Mm. Okay, so the hidden tree is really, if I was going to use a parallel to this, because the Eugenics Society used the symbol of a tree on their certificates, okay? And it was while looking at this subject matter that I came across this tree, and I thought, isn't it interesting that we have the tree in the garden, which was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then we have an organization or a movement used as a symbol of a tree to represent self-determination, humanity taking control of their own destiny, and so forth and so on. But what really drew my attention, because I recognized that I myself had done this as well, that you could switch on the television and listen to the news on politics, and that one subject could be talked about for years and no one ever come to a conclusion about how did we end up with this problem with the economy and the way that housing is, etc. And it wasn't until the dots were being connected, for example, politics with healthcare, mental testing, psychology, anthropometrics, this root system that was painted in or used by the Eugenics Society. When you look at the subjects, you realize that this was saying something more than what initially it appears to be, because it says at the root that it draws from basically everything in society to make this tree grow. And so the picture begins to develop from a seed, which is evolution, to eugenics, which then becomes this root system, to then eventually a fully grown tree, which people are still eating from in terms of its philosophy. And I undergird it all by literally using the word humanism, because it represents the full-on desire of man to worship himself, basically, which is a satanic plan.
The Copernican revolution, right? Galileo, rather than recognizing that the earth revolves around the sun, right? They believe that the sun and everything revolved around the earth. Humanism puts man at the center.
Correct, yes.
And God is a human construct even. And the divine teaching is that God is at the center.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we don't get that right, we end up with all sorts of catastrophes. And so the book takes you from what I perceive to be the beginning, because we go through transitions as well in history. For example, the Industrial Revolution was one, and then there were an explosion of inventions that when you look at some of the list of things, it's just mind-blowing. But then we move forward in time. We come through the wars. We come through.
Do you correlate? Sorry to interject here,
okay.
but do you correlate all of this to the Book of Daniel and the end time prophecy about knowledge increasing?
Yeah.
Men running to and fro.
Yeah, it's part and parcel of that. Yeah, even to the Book of Revelation, because it's there's a lot said about prophecy, but what I was really getting a hold of is that God is very practical, and when He says something, it's usually very clear. Okay, and so what he has done is given us a snapshot of where we are headed. Okay, and part of that is to do with the technology and what we create in order to improve ourselves and to become greater and become ultimately godlike. And that's where this email from the financial advisor just blew my mind, because I thought it read like a sermon. And I thought, but they're financial advisors. We no need. I mean, some of the things in this was just incredible. It was like we no longer need to pray for a miracle, because we can create it ourselves. We can give people the right eyesight back. We can replace limbs. And it was speaking a similar language to some of the earlier proponents, which were talking about a superhuman race and were striving for this. And basically, it was a cult philosophy. That's fundamentally what we're talking about, with this desire to elevate man beyond where we are to a place of godhood. And that isn't exclusive to people that don't know God. It's also including people that claim to be religious. And so this whole network is a tapestry that when it came to me, it was a shock, because then I began to think, is this really the world I live in? So
So, in the prophecies, we we know that in the millennium, for example,
mm,
to use a metaphor,
yeah,
um, eyesight, or when Jesus returned, the blind would see,
yes,
and the deaf would hear, and we do see those modern medical miracles,
yeah,
but again, no credit is given to God, who is the revealer of knowledge, wisdom, uh, you might even say the arts and the
mm,
ability to understand. Um, and so, if we're given the ability to discern and grow and learn, to practice, hopefully, medicine or
mm,
science in a positive way to help our fellow man,
yeah,
gratitude should be given to God rather than the claim that, oh, we can now do this.
yeah,
Whatever we have, it came from God. Whatever
absolutely,
intellect, whatever ability, whatever capabilities we can understand or develop,
mm,
you need to give God credit for those, and not,
yeah,
well, we don't need God now. We don't need to pray for a miracle. We can create it.
yeah, yeah. But that's the disturbing thing. But it's more. I think it's a bit of a clarion call to say, be aware. You know, for example, when we talk about science, as you say, the credit should go to God for giving us the knowledge and understanding on how to explore the world around us and how to create things. But there were individuals like Jack Parsons, who was part of NASA keeping very quiet in their history, but he was an occultist. And his whole premise for creating rockets and getting behind that technology was a mixture of his occult philosophy uh, and connecting with the cosmos and all that kind of stuff that was coming out of his religious beliefs. So then what he invented, I call it dark intel, because it wasn't rooted in something that was to um, enhance or help humankind, but it was a spiritual activity. And that seems to run through some of the individuals as well. Again, I list names and I give you their words, not mine, so it's not my interpretation of. They were some very very outstanding individuals who all had a spirit guide of one type or other, and it was from their encounter with this spirit guide that they penned or came up with a religious idea or a concept that's used in medicine or otherwise. And for the most part, it just goes unnoticed. But I've seen that myself in management training courses, and I was and this is recently, and I was completely shocked by the material that was being presented. And I asked the question of a particular lecturer. Can't say too much, but I said, "Do you know who this guy is?" And he says, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, he was an occultist, right?" And I wasn't being religious or super spiritual. I was just asking the question. Yeah. I know that. But yet his material was being used to teach us about management of people. And it was the most strangest thing that I'd experienced, because I thought I'd be taught practical things, timekeeping. How do you coordinate numbers of staff, etc.? And it was the complete opposite. So again, that just reinforced this whole thing that there is a world behind the world that Satan has created, and that's what it's about. He's created this world because he has an agenda that he would ultimately want to have complete global power or universal power, but that we know will not happen.
Well, I think that's actually a nice segue into another video I'd like to play. This is from another author who's been on the show.
Mm,
We're also reminding some of our viewers about his book.
okay.
Um, it also it's a Joseph Atman, who is also the founder of something called Middle Tree. interestingly enough, Middletree. And this is an educational institution that works in a number of states now in the United States, with school districts of I think upper elementary and junior high age is typical, where they have extra programs outside of the classroom to work with individual students. Anyway, he has a degree in the philosophy of religion, and the book that he wrote is called The Philosophical War. And the segue here, interestingly enough, is he looks at the Garden of Eden story also as the root of much of human society. But the philosophical war, in his view, is that when we were given that consciousness, when we were given that awareness through the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and in that sense, Adam named the animals, right? But then he was also given an additional challenge, which is now, as Paul says, by reason of use, he would have to exercise his senses to discern good and evil, right? I like to always bring it back to that New Testament statement, because I think the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is the tree of death, right? It is the tree of seeking out the answers for yourself apart from God.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, we don't have a choice, right? We are on that path. We can choose to seek answers from God, but usually he will make us figure it out ourselves in the end anyway, right? We will have to come to our own conclusion about it. He's not just going to supernaturally give us a pill or program knowledge into us. By reason of use, we will have to exercise our senses to discern good and evil. In that sense, that part of what the serpent said was true. We will become like God, knowing good and evil. But it's a very painful growth process, right? But the point of Joseph Atman's book is, when we engage with reality, we have to form a concept about it. We don't experience reality directly. We have 5 senses. We interact with it. We interpret it. And then we form a concept about it in our heads, right? So when we encounter God, it's virtually impossible not to create a false God in our head. We have to constantly be reminded, as again, going back to the Old Testament, the Jews, they wouldn't even say the word, right? The tetragrammaton, right? They removed the vowels so that the word couldn't even be said. So to avoid having that concept, that idea, as if you fully knew God, right? Whatever construct we have in our head, whatever conception we have about God is flawed, incomplete, inaccurate. We cannot possibly comprehend God fully. So this is part of the almost existential struggle spiritually. And with that long-winded introduction, let's just play the trailer. When we come back, we're going to look at some of the audience comments. We're going to move towards wrapping this up, and I think we're going to have you back on the show at some future time to more fully unpack this. Maybe after I've read the book and I can ask you more questions about it. But don't go anywhere. We'll come back, talk a little bit about the audience comments. But let's watch this trailer from Joseph Atman's book.
Okay.
Where the battle of minds goes unnoticed, one man dared to challenge the very structure of consciousness itself. Joseph Atman proudly presents the first part of his groundbreaking collected work, A Philosophical War. Atman's mission is to expose humanity's most elusive adversary, the structure of its own consciousness. He argues that the modern human condition is plagued by a thought process that inflicts unnecessary suffering. This thought process, like a stealthy enemy, wages war against our nature. Atman's quest is both daring and revolutionary, to overthrow and replace the current prevailing conscious structure. He identifies the enemy within and seeks a more coherent and powerful ally. With digestible bursts of epistemological guerrilla strikes, he pierces the lines of everyday thought patterns. This counteroffensive offers a new perspective, one that challenges the way we perceive reality. Atman asserts that humanity's consciousness has relied too heavily on thought alone. He introduces being with, a relationality that harmonizes humanity with the world around us. But the battle doesn't end there. Ottman reinterprets the early chapters of Genesis. He calls for the removal of contemporary notions of God while offering a profound argument for God's existence. Filled with intrigue, simplistic insights, and mystical yet realistic hope, this book is a potential landmark work. A Philosophical War by Joseph Ottman. Available at Amazon.
Interesting.
Well, I thought that kind of tied in with your book. And in addition, I want to just spend another minute on your experiences, because we didn't talk about some of the things we did in the pre-show interview,
Yeah.
where you have experiences in a variety of places around the world, directly interacting with other people who challenged your perceptions and your concepts around God, religion, spirituality. Perhaps you could share one of those anecdotes with us.
Yeah, I think probably Uganda was the one of the turning points. Of course, Israel as well, but that's probably for another time. So I was invited to go along to Uganda with a team on a mission trip. It took them 2 years. The organizers 2 years to convince me to go, and I went simply to observe. That was my purpose, and we went to a school where they had told people to come to the location. Volunteer doctors would look at them, nurses, etc. And of course, while they're waiting in the waiting room, they would have testimonies of how Jesus saves, etc. So we had all these people coming, and this lady called Christine, lovely lady, she came into the room and she pointed at me. I thought she was pointing to another chap. She says, "Come on outside. And we're walking across the ground. She says, I'm going to put you under that tree there, and I'm going to send you with a chair, and I'm going to send people to you, and you'll also have an interpreter." I said, "Well, what am I supposed to do then?" She says, "Well, pray, counsel, whatever God tells you to do." And the first lady that came along, she sat on this grass and began to tell me all the sort of problems that she had. Remember, this is where people were walking for miles just to get simple things, for infections and stuff. But they were also receiving prayer at the same time. And I remember looking at this lady. The interpreter told me exactly what she was saying and the problems she had. And I went through my catalogue of Bible teaching and studies, and literally had to, one by one, was saying, "Well, that doesn't fit this lady, and this doesn't fit, and this doesn't fit." And I was left with nothing. All of the stuff that you would traditionally hear from the platform or in your Bible classes, it was like, this isn't relevant for this lady. And so I prayed while I was there in front of her, and the Holy Spirit guided me through what to say. And I said certain things to this lady and prayed with her, and she leapt off the ground, dancing around. I thought, what's just happened? What's just happened? And I was convicted by that, because when I looked up, following her, there was a queue across the grounds that stretched out past the building, and I was there pretty much for the morning into the afternoon, and it felt like an hour. It was the most incredible experience I had. And I was convicted by what we call the message of the kingdom, that if it doesn't relate to someone like this lady in the middle of nowhere, without an income, without the modern facilities that we have, if it doesn't relate to her, then it's not the gospel. And that was one of those defining moments that caused me to begin to really look at what is it we believe, because we can spend our time protecting a denominational position, or we can think that we have got a handle, as you were saying earlier, on who God is. The reality is that we have to submit to his authority and allow him in how we're supposed to live and walk. And being there in Uganda, I'm telling you the truth, it wasn't really for their benefit, it was for mine. I experienced such an encounter with God and their love, and through these people and their generosity and how they were having nothing, that completely just changed my life. And so my whole approach to the Bible changed when I came back to the UK.
Yeah, I'm actually reminded of when I resigned from the ministry, I was full time in the ministry, doing a lot of things in Europe.
Mm.
Quite full of myself during those days, because I was doing the work of God. Right?
Yeah.
We sort
Yeah.
of reinforced within our own belief system that we were doing the work of God. I later
Yes.
gave a sermon
Mm.
on the arrogance of that. Right? It's like, what is God unemployed now?
Yes.
Right? He needs us
I
to do His
understand.
work for Him,
Yeah.
and whose work are we really doing? Right? And
True.
anyway, but prior to that, when I resigned from the full time ministry, it was to separate my faith from my paycheck. That was the primary thing because I was told now to believe certain things, to teach certain things that I didn't believe,
Mm.
that I believed I couldn't prove them in the Bible.
Mm.
So I wanted to separate my faith from my paycheck. But there was another aspect to it, and that was, when Jesus says that if you offend one of these little ones, it's better
Mm.
that a millstone be put around your neck and you'd be thrown into the deepest ocean than to
Yeah.
offend one of these little ones. But
Mm.
elsewhere it says, don't desire to be many teachers, and then it says in in the multitude of words there lacks not
Mm.
sin. And it was at the point where, especially when I was, at the heyday, and I was a celebrated speaker within our denomination,
Yeah.
giving sermons at special events to more than 2,000 people and doing so in multiple languages. And I was the first pastor of the church in Estonia and doing stuff behind the Iron Curtain. It really was kind of heady stuff that I
Mm.
was involved in. But there was always somebody who was offended, right, by what you did.
Yeah.
And I would just brush it off, right? Like, well, it's their problem, right? Because look at all
Mm.
these other people that think it's great, right? And I'm helping this person. But if you offend one of these little ones,
Mm.
so it's scary, it's terrifying, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then after I resigned, I just tried to follow where God was leading me. I ended up doing work in India that was
Mhm.
more, I was kind of going through a phase where I wanted to be more like Mother Teresa, right? Pure and undefiled religion, to visit the
Yeah.
widows and orphans in their affliction while keeping oneself unspotted from the world. So my job for me was to not, you know, to not get involved in anything
Mhm.
be abhorrent to God, while focusing on serving my fellow man.
Mhm.
And so I ended up at this AIDS village, right, in backwater India,
Mm.
where I was taken because these people wanted to be baptized.
Mm.
And there were I think 19 of them, if I recall the number. And I was terrified, and I was already sick from having baptized these farmers in this just disgusting pool of water. And we believed in full water immersion, so I had to get in with them. And then I had to pretend that I wasn't baptizing them because it was illegal in the state of Tamil Nadu. So I had to
Okay.
pretend like we were swimming, right? And so I was very sick. The
Yeah.
car breaks down coming out of this place. And it's a long story. It's in my second book, The Hardness of the Heart. And then I ended up sleeping outside in this garage outdoor car place, waiting for a part to be delivered to repair the car where I had
Mm.
been towed. And I'm getting chewed up by mosquitoes on this oily piece of cardboard on the cement. And I'm like, okay, God, now now you're showing me what it's like to pray that you would take me to where you are working, right? Show me
Mm.
where you're working.
Yeah.
Help me be where you want me to be. This is where you want me to be. And I knew it was true. I
Yeah.
didn't like it, right? I didn't like it, but there I was. And then in this miserable situation in the middle of the night, suddenly the whole village or town is up and they are marching around this mountain, and you got the three-wheeled taxis, and you got the parents with their kids and noisemakers and candles and little cymbals and bells and chants and songs and prayers. It turns out this was a spiritual area called Tiruvannamalai, which means the Red Mountains, and it's a historical spiritual area of India. Now, I came into this with this attitude that these people are deceived, right? They worship false gods. They live in misery because of all that. Um, and I was there to help them, right? Sort of almost a patronizing. And I was trying to give them spiritual, and by the way, we weren't out looking for people. They had asked for a minister to come. I didn't really
Mm.
tell the AIDS village story, that actually comes later, right?
Sure,
Right
sure.
after this event, because I got sicker. I got sicker after this. And that's when they wanted me to go to this outback where they had segregated HIV positive people.
Hmm.
And I'm talking to 19 of them who said they wanted a minister to be baptized. And that's a whole nother story. But focusing now in the middle of the night, here I am, and I'm like, what is going on, right? But that event, I trace that event to a spiritual awakening that came. It probably took a full 10 years for the seed that was planted, and it's reminiscent of Jericho, because what they were doing was walking around the mountain,
Hmm.
right? Because it was some kind of special full moon or harvest moon worship, whatever. And they were walking around this spiritual mountain in worship of God. It was a tradition that they had. And I was like in the asteroid belt of all this human worship. Uh, and I might not have understood their method of worship. I might not have known exactly how or what they were praying, but they were worshiping God. They were seeking to draw closer to God and to do his will. And it was so foreign, but it triggered something real. So those experiences that you're talking about, I have an affinity for them. Um, and there is an element that goes beyond comprehension. So, I mean, I guess to conclude, before we look at some of the audience's comments,
Yeah.
tell us a little bit more about the writing process and the actual inspiration to get this down on paper and in book format. And what do you hope
Mm.
will come from that work that you did?
Okay. Well, the inspiration of this, as I say, it's all come from a biblical worldview. That's my position, and I didn't set out to write this book, but it's the message that found me. Uh, so when I was going through this process of putting this together, it was, for example, a young lad came to me with a DVD about hip hop, and I'd left it on my television stand for ages, and I didn't look at it. And I thought, no, out of respect to him, I'll watch it, because I thought there's a lot of strange Christian ideas already going on. But I did. I watched it, and I realized there were elements in there that were actually tying in with what I was looking at. And then this whole tapestry was being created through words. And I immersed myself in that for months, months on end. I mean, the book in itself is really just an introduction. I have folders and folders of background data and information. And the thing that keeps on ringing through for me was uh, the Bible talks about an age of apostasy. And I thought, well, we used to hear that a lot in sermons, but it was like, yeah, well, this is what you're looking at, basically. So because God is not in the picture, there's all sorts of different elements that we are pulling together to try and create our version of what we think is being spiritual, is God. And so my approach in a simple way is really just taking what I was given and putting it into the pages of the book, using the tree as the focal point for the whole thing. And it was a challenge, because I had to address personal things as well during that process. Yeah. So what my hope is, that to answer that part of the question, is that really it's a tool. It's a tool for people to have as even an introduction to some of the things that we're questioning now. I mentioned mental health, for example. That was a big thing, or it is a big thing now. At the time when I was writing, I spoke to a small group about what I was discovering to do with mental illness, as it was called, and also immigration. And I said that based on what has already happened, immigration will become a big issue. And years later, it happened, right? So we had a chap who was running to become the president of America, Zoltan Istvan. I'd never heard of him, stumbled across him, and he was a transhumanist. But it wasn't about winning the election. It was about actually raising the awareness to this idea of enhancing the human body. But the question was, over and over again, why would anyone go to all this trouble? I know that there is an occult philosophy that's behind all of this. I know that Satan has his plan. But why go to all of this trouble? And of course, Israel became central to this discussion and what's happened to them as a people, but also the ultimate goal, which is to really eradicate God's covenant. And without giving you the full end story, but that is what's in the book. And I'm hoping and praying that people will get from that something that they can go away with and really use it as a bit of a research tool, because there's links, there's places where I get the information from. I try not to put my own words in there. I take the words of the people I'm referring to.
Well, and can you just share one last question about the book, since you brought this up earlier and I didn't ask it, but I meant to.
Yeah.
You'd mentioned that you had some associates, colleagues, friends, young men who had disappeared, and you saw some of them later when you were doing this hospital work. Unpack that for us a little bit. What was going on there?
Yeah. Well, these were some of them were my friends, people I knew. Others were much older than me. And what had happened was that they had disappeared into the mental health system. They were in a psychiatric hospital or having some form of treatment. And I can remember one night I was driving along the road in Derby, and I saw this chap on a bike. I noticed by the way he was riding his bike that that's someone I knew. And I pulled over in front of him, got out of the vehicle, and I said to him, "Hey, how are you doing?" And he began to tell me, "Oh, not great." I said, "I haven't seen you for ages." And he was telling me what's happened to him. And it was this recurring pattern of young black men that were being literally finding themselves in a system that once they're in it, they no longer had choices about how they were going to live. My friend, he was at, his doctor came to see him at his family home, basically said what he had to do. And my friend didn't like it because he was told he had to take medication. And he says, "Listen, I don't get on well with this stuff. I don't like it." And the doctor basically said, "You either take it or we force you to take it." And that's what they were living with. So I recognized a pattern developing. And I thought, hang on a minute, there's something more going on here. And of course, true to form, when I began to look at the whole mental health programs that were launched in recent years, because when I was writing the book, this was like, right, I'm beginning to understand this. It was traced right back to the whole eugenics philosophy,
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it still exists.
We can definitely see those roots. Homo superior, right?
Yeah. So that was affecting my community as I was seeing it. That's firsthand. I'm not making any of this up.
Yeah.
So the answers to me, and I'm not able to say in this program yet, but the answers to me were very clear. And so I began to speak to young adults, not to try and convert them to my way of thinking, but they would ask questions. They'd have personal issues, and I said, "Look, there's nothing wrong with being sad.
Right.
It's not a medical condition." Yeah, and I tell the story of a famous ballerina in the book who could have been diagnosed as having OCD, and she would have been medicated, and she would never have been a dancer. And
Right.
it was, so there is a backstory to some of this to try and give it clarity. Yeah, but it was a misnomer in the day it was first coined, this whole idea of mental illness. And that's not to say people don't experience trauma. That's not what I'm saying. But it's the language and the mechanisms then that are put in place where people are sterilized, or they're kept in psychiatric hospitals for things that are nothing to do with an illness. It's just because the power structure says if you do that, you're in there and you stay there. And that's what I bring out in the book, that we change our narrative, our language, when we're looking at the condition of when people experience trauma, loss, or what have you, that we put it in its right context and not buy into the narrative of a culture that tells you this is what it is, and then produce a manual to fit it. I hope that makes some kind of sense.
It's totally making sense. And there's so much more that we could now get into, which we'll save for another another appearance, another
Sure.
episode. What can we do about it? What are
Yeah.
alternatives to this? All of those
Yes.
questions, right?
Yeah.
But let's just now spend a moment looking at a couple of
Okay.
the comments. I'm going to pull one up here from New Man's Own. Reminds me of Job 38, 31 to 32. And I think this was at the section where we were talking about humanism, right?
Yeah.
And being God-centered. Um, and here's what Job says, right?
Hmm.
Uh, or the book of Job says, can you bind the chains of Pleiades? Can you loosen Orion's belt? Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons, or lead out the bear with its cubs? Right. So God is saying here, referring to those constellations,
Mm.
really, I am the creator of the
Yeah.
universe. And who do you think you are? So you don't need to pray to me because you can create your own miracles.
Yeah. 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 A big problem. A big problem we have, and it's repeated over and over again in the Bible to teach us that actually don't make that mistake.
Well, and I think, there are so many biblical stories that reveal this sort of Frankenstein effect, right?
Mm.
Where we think we're doing something good,
Yeah.
and it's just the creation of a Frankenstein monster, because
Yes.
we're
Sure.
going beyond the law of God. We're doing those things that God has forbidden and said, don't do those
Mm.
things. You talked about occultism.
Yeah.
Here's a comment from Crackers, CRISPR, right?
CRISPR. Yes. Yes. That's genetics. Yeah.
um, you know, stem cell manipulation. Um, Elon Musk being referenced here because
Yeah.
of the technology that's already being implemented. Of course,
Yeah.
some good being done to help
Mm.
people walk again, right? Literally helping people.
Always.
Um, but
Yeah.
it's not that technology is evil; it's the use to which it's put.
Mm. Well, he's part of the new wave of how can I put it? Elite. Like technology is like an elite religion in itself. It is mentioned in the book as well. So
Yeah, and I was just reading there's somebody I really appreciate as an author, writes for the Brownstone Institute, Jeffrey Tucker. He
mm.
was just talking about what true fascism really is, the
Yeah.
history of fascism, and books that were written pre-World War II that were celebrated,
Mm.
that were, saying that society needs to be centrally controlled,
Mm.
and that, fascism, another word for fascism is simply corporatism, in which the corporations are enlisted, encouraged, and empowered by the state. And he goes into the fact that in pre-World War II Germany, one of the things that Hitler was doing, and that was part of the overall movement,
Mm.
was removing the independence of the middle class,
Mhm.
destroying small businesses in favor of large corporations that could be controlled by the state and put
Mm.
to uses that the state wanted,
Mm.
such as armaments, right?
Sounds
Um,
familiar.
but more importantly,
Mm.
um, those people were made very wealthy through the power of the state, not through creativity, not through customer service, not through innovation,
Mm.
but through
Yeah.
alignment with a power structure and
Correct.
through service to that power structure.
Mm.
It's really a
Mm.
feudal system. You could all go all the way back to the Tower of Babel and the city that Nimrod built, Babel, the
Yeah.
gate of God.
Mhm.
Um, and then God came back and said, no, it's not. It's not a gate to God. It's confusion, right?
Yeah.
You're
Yep.
elevating yourself. You are ruling with fear. You're erecting a monument to yourself.
Mm. Mm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's that. As you say, it's still a recurring theme, unfortunately. And I believe that God is wanting us to, those that that follow Him, really to take another view. What is it we really believe about Him? And and see it as a lifestyle as opposed to a bolt-on thing.
Yeah. Here's a comment. There were several comments from Russell Shute, which I
Okay.
frankly don't understand.
No, I'm not sure.
This was when I was talking about the Jewish the religion that Moses brought and the
Okay.
beauty of the economic system.
Yeah.
Um, Shame on you for suggesting we all travel better with one foot in a Christian fantasy land. Rome
Yeah.
won the war of the Jews, so you are reading their fiction. Roman propaganda mocking Jews. I
Yeah.
don't
Don't know what
I
that
don't
means.
understand how this was arrived at from what was being said, other
Mm.
than a follow-on comment in which Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law.
Okay.
Um, well, so the law was not a curse, right? The law in itself was not a curse. The curse of the law is that you will die when you fail to obey it.
Mm.
And Jesus elevated the law to such a high standard that, as the Jews said, when he said, "It has been said, thou shalt not commit adultery," I say unto you, if you even look at a woman
Yeah.
with lust, you have committed adultery in your heart. And their reaction was, who could possibly, obey that, to never
Mm.
have those thoughts, you
Yeah.
know, to never experience greed, right? Well, it was in the Jewish law, thou shalt not covet, right?
Uh-huh.
You know, but Jesus really highlighted that the inability, the high nature of the law, such that we can't keep it. So the curse of the law is that it's impossible to fully
Mm.
keep it. Now, Jesus lived a sinless life,
Mhm.
and he was crucified and died in our stead. I don't want to get into substitutionary
Sure.
theology,
Sure.
but forgiveness was made possible because he willingly laid down his life for his friends. He willingly sacrificed himself, and his sacrifice breathed a new life into all creation.
Mm.
And the curse in that sense was removed, but the law was
Yeah.
never a curse. It was the
Uh-huh.
penalty of
Mm.
disobedience that cursed you. It's
Mm.
it's like going back to, again, I love going back to the book of Genesis, because Adam was cursed, it says. Eve was cursed. God cursed them
Mhm.
when they ate of the forbidden fruit. And of Eve, it said, thou shalt experience pain in childbirth. Your desire will be to your husband, and he will rule over you. That was a
Mm.
curse. But it
Mm.
wasn't, God didn't curse them. It's just, this will be the natural result of your actions.
Yeah. And this comes back to when we started earlier on in the program, and I mentioned to you about the question around the idea that I heard to do with the curse of Ham.
Right.
And that word curse got used so many times and misused so you end up with a slightly twisted version of what the scripture is actually saying. And what I would encourage, certainly the person that's written this, because in the book itself I highlight the fact that what we have as Christians, we owe a debt to the Jewish community, because they were first given the teachings of God, which we refer to the Old Testament, which is the Hebrew Scriptures. But think about it; it's the most Jewish book you could have. The Bible is, it's Jewish disciples, Jewish Messiah, yeah, uh, Jewish followers. The teaching was based on what you just mentioned, which is they would refer to as the Torah. So we owe a debt to them, and I think this is where we're going to be challenged now as Christians. What do we really believe? What do we really think about God? Because He has placed His covenant above His name. He's basically said, if you want to receive all these things that I promise, then you've also got to accept that I've also chosen Israel as a nation. And also, in a way, He's placed them there as a bit of a sore point for other nations. So no
Well,
matter what they do,
absolutely. So So it was very early in the conversation about lightning. You were sharing a story about a thunderstorm and lightning from east to the
yeah,
west, right?
hmm
Well, the first telegraph message,
mm,
May 24th, 1844,
hmm
traveled like lightning from the east to the west,
Mm-hmm.
Lincoln later called the telegraph messages lightning messages when he deployed them in the Civil War to end slavery.
Mm-hmm.
That lightning message was pulled from Numbers 23, verse 23. The first telegraph message, Samuel Morse's niece gave him the idea to write, "What hath God wrought?" Right? Again,
Okay.
taking technology, right? The first
Mm-hmm.
telegraph message said, "What hath God wrought?" And it
Mm-hmm.
traveled like lightning from east to the west. Now, it's my opinion,
Mm-hmm.
my belief, that that is the day that the times of the Gentiles ended. In 1844, the Ottoman Empire began to issue edicts of toleration. The
Mm-hmm.
Jews were already beginning to resettle the Holy Land, but now they were allowed to buy land. And it wasn't the Balfour Declaration necessarily. I mean, that's an important thing. But these edicts of toleration began in 1844, where Jews could begin to buy land legitimately. They could reclaim the land and buy it, such that by 1914, by the time of World War I, there was a Jewish majority in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
Jerusalem was majority Jewish already in 1914. It's a historical fact,
Yeah.
right? So my point is, the times of the Gentiles, in my view, ended in 1844, and the Jews began the process of resettling the Holy Land. But unfortunately, even though at Passover they were supposed to be saying this prayer as they raised their glass next year in Jerusalem, it became almost like a kind of a sad Jewish joke. Ugh, maybe next year in Jerusalem. Life here under the Tsar in Russia is good. We've all seen Fiddler on the Roof, I hope, right? They didn't see the need or the urgency to return
Mm-hmm.
when they began to have the chance in 1844. The gradual return, the gradual aliyah of Jews worldwide was really driven by pogroms
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and then later the Holocaust. But even then, they decided to settle in America, right?
Yeah.
And elsewhere where they could. Who wanted to go live in that desolate desert of Palestine? Mark Twain wrote about it,
Yeah. Yeah.
as being horrible. But
Yeah.
now what's my point? Well, the Numbers 23:23, the whole verse says, basically, according to this time, one obscure translation literally says, "From this day." According to this time, it shall be said of Israel, there is no curse or divination against her. What hath God wrought?
Mm-hmm.
That's the verse that's pulled from Numbers 23:23 to
Mm-hmm.
signify the end of the times of the Gentiles. That message went like lightning from east to the west. I won't talk about the further implications of that date in this program.
Okay.
But the point is, the Jews began the process of fulfilling their covenant. Why? Because going way back to the book of Leviticus and the punishment of 7 times 7, 2,520 years
Mm-hmm.
of punishment upon the not just the Jews, right? The whole house of Israel, right? There were
Yeah.
10 tribes lost. The Jews are just the nation of Judah. First time the word Jews is mentioned in the King James Bible, you find the Jews at war with Israel because there was a northern and a southern kingdom of Israel and Judah, and the 10 tribes of Israel are lost to history. But the Jews had to experience further punishment because of the fact that they had not lost their identity. In that sense, the ones who lost their identity, the ones who were in the Babylonian captivity and lost their identity, um, they didn't suffer because they weren't identified as Hebrews. The Jews retained their identity and they suffered greatly, as was prophesied 2,520 years, until the time of their trial was over, until their time of purification was over,
Mm-hmm.
until the time when they would fulfill their covenant beginning in 1844. It's a fascinating study. I don't want to get into it any more than that. I've
Yeah.
spent
It's
my
quite.
life studying it.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, one should pay real attention to what's going on in Israel because God is working out a divine master plan.
Absolutely.
And all we can say is, what hath God wrought?
And that's where I was thinking of the chap, the person that wrote statement. I've seen that many, many times. I've had those discussions around it, and we may not agree on everything, but as I say, the book really is just to try and hone some of this and get you thinking, because replacement theology is a big thing. We talk about anti-Semitism as though it's something that other people do, and without realizing it, the very philosophy that I've been talking about, it's laced with what we teach from our Bible. And that's where God is really beginning to pull things back and letting the nations know he's still God.
Well,
Just like in the
an ensign, a banner will be raised
yeah,
as a sign to the nations,
yeah,
right? And that's according to the time of returning the Jews.
yeah.
I don't want to get into it any more
That's all right.
specifically
That's
than
all
that.
right.
We're not political,
No.
but God is in charge, and He's working out a grand master plan
Mhm.
that we can only glimpse pieces of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here's another comment. When in service with pure thoughts, God speaks through you. Words flow eloquently and spiritual affection with believer. That was when you were telling the story of Uganda.
Yes, I have to say, there are. I mentioned Uganda. Israel has been a major life changer, but it's absolutely right. I think once we submit to the fact that God is sovereign and that our cleverness and everything else that we like to kind of elevate isn't really what He's looking for. He's just looking for a humble heart. Then we can begin a process of transformation and growth and change, and then we start to see His kingdom being established in other people's lives. And that to me it's just profound, because it's being in that place. I think I was there for probably maybe 8 weeks. When I came back to the UK, it was a complete shock to me. Without taking it off track, but again, going into the supermarket when I came back, and it was so fast paced. People were so focused on themselves. I just couldn't cope with being in the supermarket. I had to
Yeah.
quickly find myself in a local Christian shop playing quiet music, and someone could see I'd just had this experience having just come back from Uganda. So
I remember meeting a woman in Germany who had been freed up from East Germany.
mm,
I forget exactly the circumstances by which she was able to get out of East Germany.
mm,
But the first time she was in a German supermarket, and they're not even like American supermarkets,
right,
maybe more like the UK. But we have here in the US, we have like an entire aisle of like 100
mm,
yards of just cereal boxes, right?
sure,
But anyway, she said she broke down crying because of the variety of choices there, and she didn't know
yeah,
which laundry soap to buy or what.
yeah,
She was like paralyzed and immobilized
yep,
by this situation,
yeah, and that,
because they'd only ever had one choice of anything, and they were lucky if it was on
yeah,
the shelf at all.
yeah, for sure, absolutely. I totally identify with that. When I got home, everything was shining. Like, I thought, wow, what is this? And it
Yeah.
took a while to assimilate again, but it tells you what we actually live in. What we actually are exposed to all the time, and it does need to be stripped back in some ways.
Well, were there any of those comments or any others that you wanted to call out specifically so we can and
Mm,
I've just posted one quote that I'll show here in a minute to sort of end on.
yeah.
But any of those comments that you wanted to, designate as the receiver of your book?
Wow. This is a tough one. This is a tough one. Uh, yeah, a good show. Oh, someone paid me a compliment. Thank you very much.
Yes,
Um,
let's go ahead and show that while you're reflecting.
yeah,
Time taker.
yeah. Okay. Um, this is a tough one, Wade.
Here's another one that catches my attention when we were
Okay.
talking about Moses. You can tell it was God sent.
Yes.
Moses' idea would work even today on a lot of aspects.
Yeah, I did see that one actually, and to be honest, I think that's a good choice. We can go with that.
Well, God thought of it first. You're the designated winner. So what you want to do is send an email to and let me just type that into the chat here.
Cool.
So that it's documented if they go and look at the page.
Sure.
And they'll want to send an email to info@soupllc.com, and we will make sure that you get connected with the address and et cetera, so that book can get out to him or
Perfect.
her.
Perfect.
And I just got to make one more comment here going back. I think I threw out the question, well, who thought of that? And somebody said the Catholics or Constantine. And I just wanted to clarify what that was when I talked about Corban. And, the law was that, you could get out of giving it to God if you gave it to the church. No, this predated Christianity. This was the Jewish religious leaders. But it wasn't unique to them, and I'm not picking on them. Every religion has done the same thing. The religion ends up serving itself at some point, right? It becomes corrupt. It no longer serves God. It no longer serves the people. It becomes an institution that serves itself. That is the historical problem of all human endeavor, including when we humans try to worship God. And God has to send refreshing breezes and impulses and reformation. And if we're not open to it, I love manna, right? You talked about their clothes didn't fall into disrepair. They didn't fall into ill health. Well, part of it was because they ate manna, and manna literally, the word means, what is it? We might, it's the equivalent of WTF. I sometimes joke my middle name should be Theodore, right? Because my initials are WF, and I have no middle name, so I could invent that. But they were what is this stuff? Manna, what is it? Well, it was bread from heaven, right? The word of God. But our reaction is often, what is this? Because we're bound in our tradition. We're stuck in our concepts. We're stuck in our dogma and our doctrine. And then God has to shake us up and wake us up. And so this is the quote I sort of wanted to end on. It's from something called The Hidden Words. This is these like small, potent spiritual quotes from Baha'u'llah. This one is the first hidden word in Arabic. O son of spirit, my first counsel is this: possess a pure, kindly, and radiant heart, that thine may be a sovereignty, ancient, imperishable, and everlasting. I was reminded of this quote when you said, Valton, that God's first task was to Adam, name the animals, and how unique that was, and how he didn't micromanage it, or he was in direct relationship with God and with creation, and God said everything was good, and we can assume that the names that Adam gave to the animals were good. Animals' first creative act was to give expression, to give vocalization to some kind of name with some kind of meanings. We can sort of imagine those ancient cave paintings, right, of animals on the wall and the relationship with the creation. But anyway, this gets back to that idea of sovereignty, right? We are sovereign on earth. All things have been put in under our feet that are on this planet. As long as we submit to the greater and lesser lights in heaven, the light that shines, exposes evil deeds. Submit to the light, and you will never become enslaved. You will be sovereign before God. And the submission to the light involves our heart being pure, kindly, and radiant. I just thought I would end with that, given the nature of the discussions tonight. Any last words, Valton, that you'd like to leave with the audience before we wrap it up?
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for kind of taking the time to listen to someone like myself from the UK. But I encourage, and I'm not selling the book, I'm just saying that it's there as an important tool, I believe. And it's a message for now, because we are all on a journey. We're trying to determine, how do we live in this age? What do we do? How do we sort out?
I neglected to put out
Oh,
that QR code. My apologies, but it's there
not a
now.
problem. Not a problem.
We do want, so you can just hold up your phone to that, and
Yeah.
it'll take you right to where it's available. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and I genuinely say that this isn't something I chose to write. It's something that found me, and it will cover all the aspects of what we're dealing with. Even if you're a Christian, the sort of ideas and philosophies that are permeating our pulpits, and why, where have these things come from, and what do we do about it? And also, if you're not a Christian, but you are on a journey and searching, then he is real, and this book will hopefully give you some kind of an insight into where you can begin your journey. And as I say, it is written from a biblical perspective, so there will be a focus in that. That's where my position is. But I pray that you gain the blessing that I believe God has placed in this for you and for your families as well.
Thank you, Valton. It's been just such an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show. We will invite you back, and look forward to unpacking more, maybe practical, what to do, what not to do, what to avoid, what to go for, when we have you back on the show. My last remaining task tonight is to announce next week's guest. Dr. Rosemary Downer will be speaking on the topic of the power of forgiveness. We'll be releasing the sneak peek here this week. Dr. Rosemary Downer, interestingly, also spent the first 12 years of her life in Jamaica. I don't know how this happened, this coincidence. We're having a lot of spiritual energy emanating from that warm-hearted island. And she's lived in Canada and the US. She is also very much focused on the Word of God, as represented by the Holy Bible, Old and New Testaments. But this focus of forgiveness, and we'll be delving into practical strategies for applying that in our lives. And she's got some very unique perspectives on it. You really don't want to miss this wonderful talk with Dr. Rosemary Downer. But Valton, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Definitely look forward to having you back.
No, appreciate it. Thank you, Wayne.
So until next week, 8 p.m. Central Time, this is your host with our guest Valton signing off. And until